Hello, I'm Johnny Cash.
It's February 1969, and Johnny Cash is in the clink, but not for reasons you might think. The Man in Black and his band are at California's San Quentin State Prison to perform a concert for the inmates, which is being taped for British TV. The resulting album, At San Quentin, would be released in June of the same year. The second of Cash's prison albums, At San Quentin is most famous for making a certain hand gesture, a symbol of outlaw country music. The 10-track record includes staples like Walk the Line and Folsom Prison Blues, but also a traditional ballad, The Wreck of the Old 97. Though it is not a Cash original, this is the most storied song on the album, and possibly the most famous train song of all time. Conflict is the driving force behind any great piece of art. How does a person respond to conflict? How are challenges overcome and the victory won? Or, alternatively, how does a situation overwhelm the individual, leaving only the bitter reality of defeat? Throughout history, scholars and critics have categorized literary conflict in various ways. These categories pit the individual, man, against a force that must be battled, be it another person, society, fate, the natural world, supernatural forces, or even the self. These are ancient concepts that go to the root of the human experience. But how does man confront a completely new threat? Indeed, something of his own creation. The coming of the Industrial Revolution brought about a relatively new classification of conflict: man versus machine. This is not to be confused with the terrible 1992 science fiction TV series Man and Machine, where a Los Angeles policeman is partnered up with an attractive female android to fight crime in the future. Man vs. Machine stories generally focus on an individual or group in conflict with technological threats. This threat is often the result of man's short-sightedness in creating technology. The creator himself may have been blinded by greed, pride, or desire for endless progress. The individual or group must then do battle with the mechanical threat. In the case of victory, man's triumph over his creation shows the resolve of the human spirit. Alternatively, man's defeat at the hands of his own technology serves as a cautionary tale and warning. But how did we, as a species, begin doing battle with technology? How did the creations of our brightest minds lead to the realization of our darkest fears? The Industrial Revolution may well be considered the beginning of modernity. It was the era in history when things began to speed up, and they haven't slowed down since. For most of human history, the fastest a person could travel was on a horse. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Joan of Arc, and George Washington all moved at the same general speed. This element of speed changed with the coming of industrialization. By the mid-19th century, a journey that might have taken months across the Atlantic Ocean in a tall-masted sailing ship would only take 2 weeks by steamship. A message would only take minutes if transmitted by telegraph. A journey of several months across America in a covered wagon could now be completed in a week by rail. Factory production changed the way people lived and worked, as well as how they accessed food, fuel, and other necessities. Whole societies in Europe and America would be reorganized along industrial lines, as mechanization transformed communication, transportation, warfare, and social life forever. But it was not an easy transition from a 3-mile-per-hour world to a mechanized society. In some cases, it would be a violent birth, fraught with figurative and literal labor pains. The weavers of Manchester, England were frustrated. Unlike their American cousins in the 13 colonies, their anger was not provoked by an oppressive government or unjust taxation, but against certain machines. Weaving and textiles had been major industries in northern England since the late Middle Ages, and the well-established weavers of Manchester saw new machine looms and knitting frames as a threat to their very livelihood. Enter a young man named Ned Lud. Lud was an apprentice weaver who, in an act of passion, destroyed one of the new machines.
Fired up.
This inspired his fellow craftsmen to riot and destroy the hated looms. While Lud's historical existence is debated, he became a folk hero whose name would be invoked whenever a machine mysteriously broke down. The Albian Mills were the largest flour mills in Britain, and the first steam-powered flour mills in the world. For the past 5 years, the mills had dominated the London flour market. Enormous steam engines drove 20 pairs of millstones, which could grind 6,000 bushels of flour per week. The success of the Albian Mills threatened to put small independent millers out of business, and with no major competition to stand in the way, the price of bread rose. Londoners were angry, feeling ground down by the high price of bread, as well as economic changes beyond their control. On March 2nd, 1791, at 6:30 p.m., a mysterious fire engulfed the Albion Mills. The 6-story building burned for 2 hours and was left completely gutted. Nobody was killed, but 500 people were left unemployed. Arson was highly suspected, but nobody was charged with the crime. London millers, on the other hand, rejoiced, celebrating with public demonstrations and signs reading, "Success to the Mills of Albion," but no Albion Mills. The mills were never rebuilt, but they remained a symbol of an unsettling industrial reality. The poet William Blake, inspired by the hulking ruins along the Thames, refers to dark satanic mills in his 1804 poem, "And Did Those Feet in Ancient Time." These lines would later be adapted into the patriotic song Jerusalem, an English anthem still sung by association football fans today. Truly an example of man's struggle against machines, set to the music of the people. English weavers in Nottinghamshire now had a new leader in their fight against their old enemy, the mechanized loom. In one generation, the humble apprentice Ned Lud had been transformed into a mysterious figure, now known as Captain Lud, General Lud, or King Lud. Supposedly a native of Sherwood Forest, King Lud commanded his followers to destroy the machines that threatened their livelihoods. And like Robin Hood, Lud had become the populist outlaw who battled the rich for the sake of the poor. Most famously, he would give this Luddite movement its name. Beginning in the spring of 1811, Luddites smashed looms and knitting frames in Nottinghamshire, with direct action spreading throughout Britain. Hundreds of machines were destroyed, and the movement gained momentum. Luddites became famous for their use of sledgehammers to smash machines. It must be said that the Luddites were not anti-technology on principle, but concerned for the loss of their skilled trades, and would only target those machines they saw as a threat. From 1812 to 1813, the Luddites continued to launch campaigns against the factories. In response, the British government called out the army. Troops fresh from the Napoleonic Wars engaged in urban battles with the Luddites. Many Luddites were hunted down, jailed, and ultimately hanged or transported to Australia. Numbers dwindled, and by 1817 the movement was dead, and the Industrial Revolution in full swing. The Industrial Revolution swam the Atlantic and reached the northern United States in 1814, with the first textile mill opening in New England. Soon cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia became major industrial centers. King Lud had no followers in the young American Republic, but economic and cultural resistance to industrialization existed in some regions, specifically the South. Mechanization was one of the major factors in the outcome of the American Civil War, where an industrialized North defeated an agrarian South. Southern soldiers, generally undersupplied and increasingly ragged by the end of the war, were partial to the music of a Northerner named Dan Emmett, whose most famous composition was Dixie, the unofficial national anthem of the Confederacy. Northern soldiers, outfitted with all the supplies and weaponry of an industrial power, sang the songs of Henry Clay Work, who most famously wrote Marching Through Georgia. Both songwriters would remain popular throughout the 19th century and inspire musicians of the post-war generation. With a Union victory in the Civil War, industrial capitalism was free to spread from Atlantic to Pacific, with the first transcontinental railroad opening in 1869. Rail became the all-American symbol of speed, progress, and mechanization. Railroads were also a major part of the physical reconstruction of the South after the war. Two railway giants came together in the summer of 1894, and would dominate southeastern freight and passenger rail for the next 88 years. The Richmond and Danville Railroad merged with the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia Railway. The new corporation was aptly christened Southern Railway. By the early 20th century, Southern Railway was a power player in regional rail and was ready to fire up a new train, the Fast Mail. This lean, mean machine held a U.S. government contract to deliver mail from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans and held track priority over all other trains. The first run of the Fast Mail made it from Washington, D.C. to Atlanta in 22 hours, a record time, and set another record when it arrived in New Orleans 33 hours later. The southbound Fast Mail train was given the number 97, later affectionately called the Old 97. Though they were masters of one of the fastest trains in America, the company bosses of Southern Railway had no idea that the beloved Old 97 would soon go flying into history again. It was a warm Sunday in September when the Old 97 departed Washington, D.C. The train was small for speed, pulled by engine 1102, a 460 steam engine made by Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. It included 2 railway post office cars, a baggage car, and an express car for freight. The train was also an hour late, due to a connection delay. When the Old 97 pulled into Monroe, Virginia, a new crew was set to take over for the next leg of the journey to Spencer, North Carolina. The engineer was 33-year-old Joseph Andrew Steve Brody. Why he was nicknamed Steve is unknown, but it is possibly a reference to another Steve Brody, a daredevil who was the first man to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge and survive. A native of Saltville, Virginia, Steve Brody was an experienced engineer, but new with the Southern Railway. Used to handling heavier freight trains, this would be his first time at the helm of the Old 97. The rest of the engine crew is made up of 2 firemen, Albian C. Clapp and a trainee fireman, John Madison Hodge, whose jobs were to feed and maintain the coal-fired engine. A conductor, flagman, express messenger, and 11 postal workers were also set to travel on this run. The Federal Mail contract was big money, and Southern Railway would be fined heavily for every minute under time. But the company had a protocol for this situation. At Monroe, Steve received run late orders. These were instructions to run 45 minutes late into Lynchburg and 40 minutes late into Danville. He could not arrive in Danville before the appointed run late time, but per company rules in this situation, he could make up a maximum of 28 minutes, if possible. The crew had no explicit orders to speed up, but it was normal that they would try to shave off a few minutes here and there. One unsubstantiated legend states that Steve declared that he would put the Old 97 in Spencer on time or put her in hell. The exact speed throughout the journey is still a controversy today. The 5-mile trip from Monroe to Lynchburg was uneventful, though a last-minute passenger joined the train at Lynchburg. Wentworth Armistead, a safe locker, who was entrusted with the combination to the Southern Railway safe, would now be along for the ride to Spencer. As Steve left Lynchburg, the train began speeding up. To save time at wide turns, engineers would often hit the brakes, then accelerate to keep speed, a practice known as whittling. However, repeated attempts at this would cause the air brakes to lose average pressure, which could lead to a loss of braking power altogether. Some on board the train would later state that Steve never hit the brakes at all after Lynchburg. The Old 97 flew through Chatham Station without slowing down. At Dry Fork, the mail clerks tossed the outgoing mail bag from the train, but were unable to grab the incoming mail bag from the arm on the side of the tracks. The next landmark was White Oak Mountain, a relatively easy climb, especially for the small but powerful Old 97. At the bottom of White Oak Mountain was Stillhouse Trestle, a railroad bridge 75 feet tall and 500 feet long. The next waypoint after the trestle was Lima, a depot 3 miles north. What happened next is known only to God and Steve Brody, but the Old 97 wouldn't be crossing the trestle that day. On the downhill descent, just before the trestle, the railroad curved. The fast mail would usually cross the bridge at 50 miles per hour, but was now going much faster. E.H. Chappell, a local resident, was taking a drink of water from his well when he heard the Old 97 coming down the mountain. It was a roaring sound, and while I couldn't see the track from where I stood because it ran through a deep fill at that point, I saw a great pillar of billowing dust moving very fast. It was the train, of course, and she was making a weird, unusual noise. I remembered I turned to my mother, who was with me, and said, "She'll never make the trestle." It's at this point, while descending White Oak Mountain, that Steve probably realized he was going too fast. It's possible that he didn't have time to brake, or that he had no pressure left and he had lost his air brakes. With a runaway train on his hands, Steve did the last thing he could. He shifted into reverse. The engine's 10 wheels locked up, sparks began to fly, and the old 97's whistle screamed through the autumn air. Steve would blast the whistle all the way down White Oak Mountain. A later author recounted the scene in Danville as the train hurtled toward the curve. The whistle gave a series of blasts on the approach to Lima, and finally set up a constant broken wailing down the 3-mile grade to the Dan Valley. It was the death cry of a runaway locomotive, and it chilled the hearts of all who heard it. People turned in their yards, ran out on their porches, stopped still along the streets in North Danville. All eyes turned in the direction of the approaching train. With bated breath and anxious hearts, they waited. Hitting the curve, the old 97 jumped the tracks and plummeted off the cliff. A moment later, the 64,500-pound locomotive crashed at the bottom of Stillhouse Creek, followed by the 4 railroad cars splintering as they collided with the engine and each other. The crash was heard up and down the Dan River Valley. Alarm bells rang at the Riverside Cotton Mill. Church bells began to toll, and the people of Danville rushed to see what had happened just outside town. At the bottom of Stillhouse Creek, rescuers and onlookers found a wrecked engine covered in red Virginia mud. The railroad cars had been reduced to twisted metal and wooden splinters. Adding to an already surreal scene, small yellow birds were singing and hopping about the wreck. A cargo of canaries, bound for an Appalachian coal mine, had been packed into the express car and managed to escape their fate. In and around the train were the bloody and mangled bodies of dead and injured men. Some were almost unrecognizable, mutilated by the crash and boiler steam. Steve Brody's body was found outside his engine, having been thrown by the force of the impact. One Danville resident remembered carrying the dying engineer. The skin came off his arm just like a chicken's that scalded. Somebody came from the houses above, and 2 or 3 men helped me pick up the engineer and put him on the bank. He drawed 2 or 3 breaths, and that was the end of him. Steve Brody was one of 11 to die as a result of the crash. The 7 survivors were all injured, with the exception of express messenger W.F. Pinckney. He would walk away from the old 97 without a scratch. The next day, he returned to his home in Raleigh, North Carolina, and immediately put in his resignation from Southern Railway. The people of Danville would never forget the disaster that shook their community on September 27, 1903, the day their town became the end of the line for the old 97. The wreck of the old 97 made national news and became a legend. Almost immediately, folk musicians picked up on the story and began to sing it in ballad form. In true folk tradition, different verses were set to various well-known tunes and passed around by performers. The most notable tune was that of The Ship That Never Returned, an 1865 composition by Henry Clay Work. Versions of the wreck of the old 97 were performed for almost 2 decades before any recordings were made, some with slightly different titles. Lyrics differ here and there, but they generally tell of engineer Steve falling behind time and being ordered by the railroad company to speed up his train. The brave engineer then dies in a tragic wreck that was entirely avoidable. It ends with a warning to women to not speak harsh words to their husbands, as they may leave for work one day and never return. Ultimately, in all versions of the song, a man does battle with a machine and loses. While not anti-industrial in itself, the song does criticize a railroad corporation that insists on a fast delivery, even at the expense of a man's life. Interestingly enough, it would be another technological advancement, that of modern recording technology, that would immortalize the ill-fated Steve Brody and the old 97. It would also spark a different kind of struggle, this time between another railroad man and an American corporate machine. The first commercial recording of the ballad was in 1923 by Virginia musicians G.B. Grayson and Henry Witter. However, the most successful version would be recorded 1 year later by Vernon Dalhart and Carson Robinson. Released by the Victor Talking Machine Company, this 1924 version was the first country song to sell 1 million records. But just as Americans love country music, Americans also love litigation, especially involving convoluted copyright law. In 1927, David Graves George, a railroad brakeman and telegraph operator, sued the Victor Company, claiming to be the true author of the song. George was a witness to the 1903 wreck and argued the ballad was inspired by his own experiences. In 1933, a judge declared George as the rightful author, demanding that Victor pay $65,000 in restitution. Victor appealed 3 times. 2 higher courts ruled in favor of George, while the third favored the Victor Company. George finally appealed to the Supreme Court in 1934, which ruled that he had filed his appeal too late and granted Victor ownership of the song. Ironically, the 1924 Victor recording is full of inaccuracies. Steve the engineer becomes a man named Pete. The line, "Put her in center on time," means nothing, and is possibly a mispronunciation of the train's destination at Spencer, North Carolina. The old 97 was not ordered by the company to speed up because the train was late, though there might have been speeding on the part of the driver. The black greasy fireman on the engine crew was a white man, though this could be interpreted as him being black from coal smoke. The train wasn't going 90 miles an hour, but likely closer to 70, per the company report and various eyewitnesses. The engineer was not found dead with his hand on the throttle, nor was he a true loving husband, as he was unmarried. It must be said that most renditions from the 1920s and beyond do refer to the engineer by his correct nickname, but still include the other aforementioned historical licenses. Of course, this is not strange to anyone familiar with the folk and ballad tradition. Folk music, literally the music of the people, is naturally passed around. The musicians who performed the wreck of the old 97 in the early days changed some of the history to enhance a story, make a point about labor and industry, or simply because these were the lyrics they were taught by other musicians. What was new was the litigious wrangling of individuals and corporations who claimed to own a folk song that had been freely shared for 2 decades. Also, that the argument would go all the way to the highest court in the land, where 9 men in black robes would make a dogmatic pronouncement, deciding who truly owned music that belonged to the people. After the wreck, Engine 1102 was recovered from the mud of Stillhouse Creek. It was hauled to North Carolina and repaired at the company shops in Spencer. Ironically, this was where Steve Brody and his crew would have disembarked at the end of their fast mail run. The engine would continue in Southern Railway service until 1935, when it was retired and scrapped. The Stillhouse trestle was also quickly repaired, as it had suffered damage in the accident. The fast mail would continue to pass over White Oak Mountain and the trestle below until the bridge was dismantled in 1938 and the rail line abandoned. An alternative route now carries freight from Lynchburg to Danville. Southern Railway continued to haul freight and passengers until 1982, when it merged with the Norfolk and Western Railway, becoming Norfolk Southern. A historical marker memorializes the site of the wreck, and a mural in downtown Danville tells the story of the 1903 disaster. The famous musical commemoration lives on through performances by folk and country artists, including Johnny Cash's rockabilly version from inside the walls of San Quentin. 120 years later, the old 97 still rides high in the country repertoire along trains like the Wabash Cannonball, the Midnight Special, and the City of New Orleans. But what of the man at the throttle of the ill-fated train? Steve Brody was quietly laid to rest in a family plot in Washington County, not far from his hometown of Saltville. It's a small, rural cemetery off the beaten path in southwest Virginia. He receives few visitors, mostly old-time music fans who know him from a century-old tragedy and a song that still echoes down the years. He was the master of a machine that got the better of him. Now man and machine have been made immortal through the most famous train song in American history. And yet the price of immortality might just be that you are remembered differently than you really were.